So on drums, highly recommend. Helps you get better at what you do, and when you practice, it makes things usually develop and improve faster.
Hey Emma, what drum kit do you use?
Am I too old to start playing drums?
Should I get lessons?
How do I
Why
play
do
fast?
drums cost
When
so
will I
much?
start sounding good?
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. Today we are going to be talking about what?
Drumming and meditation. How can drumming be used as a mindfulness practice?
So I have done a video on this, but I was just thinking that I think there may be. Well, it's kind of about, you were saying, flow state, right? Is meditation and flow state while playing an instrument kind of a similar thing? Yes and no. I think flow state feels like, to me anyway, it has some kind of barrier to entry, and I think that barrier is you're already playing quite consistently. Maybe it just makes it easier to access because there's less of like a warm-up stage to get to that point where you're not really thinking about what's coming out, and you can really relax into what you're doing instead of thinking about the technicalities of what you're doing. But anyway, let me backtrack to actually meditation on drums. I find drumming, and specifically practicing the same thing over and over again, very, very meditative. And sorry, I was just laughing because there's a clip from the shoot we did in Paris that Sean's edited where it's just me trying to pronounce meditative, and then you tell me how to pronounce it, but you tell me how to pronounce it wrong, and I knew I wasn't wrong.
Sounds about right.
Anyway, so what I like to do in terms of meditating and really relaxing on the drum kit is I find a metronome helps. You can pick whatever you want to do, whatever you're practicing, whatever one you want to get better at, whether it's a specific bit of a song or if it's something technical like improving your left hand dexterity or whatever. For me it was that especially. And I often find that having a 16th note metronome really helps me like hone in and just zonk out. I usually don't go much over a bar either. Like it's a bar long thing or even shorter than that sometimes. And you just sit and you play it and you really just let yourself zone out. Once you've got it down, then it just get absorbed into your being basically. And a way I like to really get into something like that is to go limb to limb and really perfect what is going on limb to limb. So for example, you're playing 4 limbs over this bar. First of all, focus on the right hand. How in time is it compared to the metronome? What are the dynamics doing? What are you doing technically? What like technique are you using? And once that sounds really good and something else might sound off, then you move over to whatever limb you want to do next and do exactly the same thing. Because I think dynamics, especially internal dynamics within a groove and things like that, are often overlooked, especially on electric kits, because it's a lot easier to overlook that aspect of things. So we're kind of crossing over into different points here, but internal dynamics, I think, makes or breaks your playing. I think it really separates people who sound like they know what they're doing from people who don't sound like they know what they're doing. And it's often not people's fault, because if you're self-taught, it's not something that's, I think, really talked about enough. Maybe I just haven't seen enough about it, but I don't think it's talked enough about, because it is the difference between whether you sound like you know what you're doing or not. To me, that's my opinion.
Well, the dynamics end up, sorry to interrupt them, but
you carry on.
End up, we talked about the last podcast that we did with Vicky, and we talked about the drumming fundamentals, timing, feel, all these kind of things, and the dynamics end up helping the flow and therefore the feel, right? Because if let's take a paradiddle groove, I'm going to voice it because we're not in the crit, and you go dum da dum dum da dum da da dum da. But if it's da da, all of a sudden that has a flow to it, right? So the dynamics equal.
Well, it's kind of like speaking, isn't it? Naturally, there's bits that get emphasized and bits that don't, and that tells you what someone is trying to say, but how they're trying to say it. So it's like basically you're playing drums in monotone, if you're not using dynamics. That's a really good way of putting that.
That is very good. I've marked the clip as a very useful one.
Yes. But my point with that was something. We're going to remember what it was very shortly. Well, it's going back to meditation, really. So you can go limb by limb and really correct dynamics. Once you've got the technical side, yes, it's in time. I suggest you actually bring the whole dynamic down. See how quiet you can play it in time, still sounding good, and then really emphasize what you want to emphasize. Maybe go limb by limb, make that as loud as you can, and everything else really quiet. It will serve you well doing everything, but jazz especially, because dynamics are so different when you're playing jazz compared to contemporary music, for example.
There's a different level of coordination to achieve those different dynamics, right?
Yeah, and actually I was talking to someone about this. Dynamics on an electric kit specifically will trip you up if you have never really played acoustic kits before. And I often find this when I've jumped on an acoustic kit for the first time in a long time. It's like, oh my god, this is so loud. Oh wow. And it's time to adjust everything, all your limbs, and like, oh, I actually don't need to hit this at all, really. Especially when you're doing something like recording. I did a recording session in Wales back in, I think, March or April, and it was like, I don't need to hit this kit at all to do what we're doing here. And that was a major shift in thinking, because I've been doing gigs where you just literally smack the hell out of the drum kit, and the pitfall of electric drum kits is you can have the volume way, way down and be smacking the hell out of the drum kit, and that feels normal to you. And as soon as you get on a real kit with real people, it's like, oh my god, this is all wrong, and they're all yelling at me. Not that I can hear them because it's so loud, but yeah, it's something to definitely be aware of. So this is kind of 2 points how to meditate on drums.
But actually, again, linking it back in, so the cymbals are the biggest thing here in terms of what we're talking about being an issue, right? More than anything else.
Really?
Because if you turn the cymbal volume down when you're hitting it hard, right, all of a sudden, like the kick, apart from very specific scenarios of maybe feathering the bass drum when you're playing jazz, which is just keeping a very quiet bass drum going, and let's not get into that, but like, so there's those different and other things that generally, for the majority of contemporary music, you can pretty much get away with hitting the kick hard, right? And you're not, I think, anyway. And again,
in most cases.
In most cases, snare drum, not quite the same. That can be an issue, right? And a massive rim shot in certain venues may be slightly inappropriate, for sure, right? But the cymbals are the one that then causes havoc, because if you're in smaller venues in particular, they don't have that dynamic control. The sound engineer can't just turn the cymbals down. They are overpowering everything immediately. So in small venues, that's a huge issue. A lot of function gigs that you'll do where it's at a wedding, for example, and things like that, that's going to be that scenario. Really needs to have that dynamic control. On electric drum kit, you can just either turn those pads down, right? Or you can, it doesn't even really, they never get that loud. Like, they're just designed not to get that loud. So yeah, for sure. And obviously then when you come to do it acoustically, trying to be back in that flow state is hard, because you're used to hitting it hard to equal flow state and meditativeness, right?
It's a tricky one as well, because if you bought a drum kit to be quieter and you're wearing headphones to do it, then there's a fine balance of, I need this loud enough so it sounds over the sound of the pads, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
But you also don't want to deafen yourself.
Yeah.
And the natural thing to do would be, this sounds really, really loud, I need to turn it down.
Yeah.
Whereas the actual answer is you need to play it quieter. Because drums are that loud, my friend. Yeah. They are that loud.
They are, exactly. No, you're right. Actually, that's a solution. Electric kit, turn it right up and then play quiet. Just be careful your ears if you do end up.
It's not, obviously it's not exactly the same, because you don't have a drum kit right here. No. So that is something to be. There's a fine balance to it, I think, personally. I mean, the solution is, if you can, try and get some time on an acoustic kit, and you'll see exactly what I mean, if possible. But I think we've talked about that anyway, right? We've talked about what.
Sure, but we can recover it. This stuff is these are things. I think this is what's interesting about having a podcast format as well. For people listening, like, if you hear the thing, us say the same thing 7 times, there's probably some kind of merit to it, especially if that same thing keeps overlapping different topics of conversation, right? So we're going to talk about dynamics on the drum kit when we're talking about lots of things, because as we just said, it affects feel, and feel affects the overall performance. Therefore, so it's going to keep coming up. The same topics will continuously come up. So I think that that's just reinforcing it. You know, you don't get told something once and then you go and apply it. You're going to listen and go, okay, cool, that's really cool. I'm going to take it in. And so I don't think it's a problem. I think it's cool. Again, you guys let us know if we're banging on about the same thing too many times. Then,
absolutely.
Then
and if you agree, because some people might completely disagree. We've probably got some purists out there going, you should never play an electric kit, but I disagree personally.
And that's one of our next podcasts that I'm hoping to have Vicky on board, is
really?
For us to talk about acoustic versus electric versus hybrid, and how that's shaping the industry and what's changing there.
Interesting.
And where that's going, because you're seeing more and more drummers, especially session drummers, in scenarios actually using electric drum kits, because they can cut out such huge sound check issues in these big stadiums, and often all they're doing for the majority of it in a lot of bands and artists, and I won't say who, what, where, is triggering it, right? So you're barely hearing the snare drum that is the original snare drum anyway in so many scenarios.
Because electronic music, like, you can't.
But even bands, even bands that are supposed to be acoustic, you're hearing this more and more. And then you're right, like electronic music. So those bands are also turning more into, well, there's a hand clap at the same time as the snare. So there's a trigger that does both. But yes, that's a different thing. But the reason why I think this is interesting is that, so I can't really play an electric drum kit very well, but I might be required to at some point in the future as part of a performance on stage, which I would have never considered when I first started playing. And that's something to be aware of. If you want to be gigging and doing things, you might have to play electric drum kit.
That's such an interesting perspective. I think that is the perspective most people have, actually, especially older. You're not an older drummer, but like if you're not a kid currently who's growing up with electric kits, like, well, I grew up with electric kits. The idea of moving over to electric feeling awkward is really odd to me. Granted, I'm very fortunate that moving to an acoustic for me doesn't feel really alien, and obviously I prefer it because acoustic kits are amazing, and you can't recreate that feel really. Maybe if you had one of those like bass drum vibrate-y seat things, maybe, still not the same.
I think it's also, for me, like, especially with mesh heads, which it seems to be we go into a lot of electronic drums, they just respond so differently. When
it's easier.
I also find that they still, even the really good ones, they still mistrigger on the snare. Like, you still get a randomly slightly louder ghost note. When we were at the bag show, the Paris drum show last year, there was a really great drummer, wasn't there? As a gospel drummer, I know we saw more than one probably, but there was one that was using electric kit. And you definitely heard a bunch of like mistriggers on the kit. Sorry, not the kit, the snare drum, when they were doing ghost notes, where they would be, those ghost notes normally on the drum kit on stage would be what I kind of say felt and not heard, whereas they were coming out quite prominently and over pronounced, if that makes sense.
They still, I don't know what the processing power that's required to have that dynamic range is, but that is definitely an element that between the two that you do notice, definitely. And the control required to be able to get that to sound that good on an acoustic kit, like the really ghost notey stuff that I did in like the Equalizer and Left Hand Bootcamp and stuff like that. All of that is a lot easier on an electric kit because it just bounces easier and responds more consistently because there's only a certain amount of sample noises that you've got. So actually the difference that you can get between those notes, volume wise and sound wise, is limited, and therefore it's going to sound more consistent naturally.
And I think
actually, I can tell you now, it's a lot harder on an acoustic kit to do all that stuff.
And this is where I think it's interesting, because I find it easier on the acoustic kit. So, and it's because I spent so much, 99% of my time has been on kit. Despite owning an electric drum kit, I barely touch it, and it's done more for demonstration purposes and necessity when I need it. Right. Sometimes demos, recordings, things like that. So yeah, that's an interesting thing. Like, I guess it'd be fun to hear in the comments who finds it easy. Not what do they prefer, but what do you find easier to play, electric or acoustic? And then if we just tie this back into the meditation and that sort of things, like, I can't get into that flow state on an electric kit because it just jumps out stuff to me and it drives me mad. You play an electric kit and I'm like, have you edited any of that? And you're like, no. And I'm like, what? It's so good. And like, to me, it blows my mind. And then
I wonder if it's made me a tighter player or not. I do wonder that.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. That's an interesting
and I think
thing
there's actually a number of reasons, because I was just thinking there's actually a benefit to having electric kits. And now I'm thinking there's more. Well, obviously there's lots of benefits, but there's two that have just sprung to mind of, like, I know I just said don't turn down your drum kit, but in terms of the damage that your hearing might take from being around an acoustic kit all the time, and also the sonic quality of what you get, especially from an acoustic kit with huge headphones on, isn't really going to sound that good, honestly, is it? Whereas with an electric kit, you've got your metronome going in your ears and also the direct sound of the kit, so it's right there. You can hear everything, so you can then fine tune everything. But if you also want to just do something like with the consistent ghost notes, if I'd done that on acoustic kit, they would have driven me mad, I think, because it just would have been so loud. And the metronome would have had to be so loud. You could have it in your ears, I guess. But, like, yeah, it's definitely interesting. The more you go into it, it's just like, actually, neither is better than the other.
No, they have different purposes. And I think that really it comes back to, I think you should just be proficient in both. I think that's probably what the answer. When it and that's it. Interesting. I mean, we did a massive tangent from what we were initially, but it'd be interesting to hear what you guys have to say on this, and just
definitely
what I would like to know what people actually who are practicing regularly on just one and then go to another occasionally, vice versa. People have access to both. Like, give us a bit of detail on your experiences and where you're at right now. Like, you might have a studio down the road you go to once a week and the rest is an electric kit. Maybe it's once a month. Maybe you only touch the acoustic kit in band practice. Like, whatever it is, it'll be interesting to hear.
Kind of like me.
Yeah, exactly. Emma's very much that. So, and can you get into flow state? First question, at all. Have you felt that flow state? If so, can you do it on electric? Can you do it on acoustic? Like, and what does that feel like for you as a like, it's hard to explain flow state sometimes, isn't it?
Some people might be completely the other way, like they can't have a metronome to get into flow state. However, that could also be that you just don't know how to play with the metronome, maybe.
Sure. Yeah.
Potentially.
Yeah, which, like, it's an interesting one when who was it? I can't remember. I think it was a Paul McCartney interview, and someone asked him about, do you play to click the track? The Beatles, and like, it didn't exist. The metronomes were just those old-fashioned things that ticked for a pianist, right? And they weren't like 100% accurate anyway. And none of their tracks was done to that. And he I feel like, gave us the flow, because if
also more credit to Ringo.
Yeah, and he said that, and he said Ringo's that's why he's such a fantastic drummer. He said occasionally he will maybe speed up or whatever as the intensity of the song increases, and said that was extremely rare anyway, first and foremost. But when that did, we all went as a band, and actually it felt right
to the music.
Yeah, it added to it. So there's another thing.
That's a whole other conversation.
That is a whole thing. Yeah,
because,
we could go off on tangents all day long about this.
The change in music and the fact that the sense of dynamics has been lost in modern music, and also using changes in speed and time in modern contemporary music has basically evaporated, which is crazy.
I wonder whether that's going to be the thing that will separate us from the robots. Is it going to be that going back
human feel?
Because vinyl keeps coming back. There's a reason for that. It's not because people are nostalgic, because younger people want it, and they're like, there's obviously probably
it's the same reason people like film. I personally love film photography, so it's like that tangible, real thing Like that is a physical piece of music ingrained in a physical thing. And it's right there. Oh my God. So I think that's the value in that, personally. I was going to make another point in that, but that would have been a whole other tangent too. There's so much to talk about.
There's so much. I think we can probably wrap it up there.
Oh, that was my
go on then, Emma. Go on. Another 10 minutes of the next thing.
As soon as AI has taken over and everyone's like, oh my God, I can't see we're going to have a jazz movement because everyone's going to be like, it needs to be free, man. It's the most human you can get. Oh my God. No click
I think
ever.
so. I think it'll be maybe some very
what do you
interesting
mean you use
hybrid.
click track, man?
Yeah, almost like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that AI will be able to absorb all that and probably do a job of that as well. But yeah, I think it's going to be interesting times with that.
So meditating on drums.
Yeah.
Highly recommend. Helps you get into flow state and helps you get better at what you do. And when you practice, it makes things usually develop and improve faster. That's my Cliff Notes version of that. Bye-bye.
That's I did this earlier as well, but that's a mic drop from Emma and off we go.
Yeah.
That was all we needed to say. All right, guys. Well, thanks. Drop comments in and we will see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Ciao for now.
Namaste, my fellow drummers. I hope you're feeling equally as chill as I am. So chill, in fact, that you don't want to leave the channel and want to continue watching this podcast, where we answer questions such as, should I have one-to-one lessons or stay self-taught? Or, does practice make perfect? The answer might not be as obvious as you think. Either way, have a fantastic day. Big love. Mwah.